Are you a Cricut beginner who's confused about working with heat transfer vinyl and your Cricut? My name is Alex Vanover with DIY Alex, and I'm so glad that you're here. Because in this Cricut tutorial, I'm going to be giving you all the tea on heat transfer vinyl, also known as HTV, so that you can bring your crafty dreams to life. In this Cricut tutorial, I'm going to be breaking down all the things I wish I knew as a Cricut beginner, like what HTV is, exactly how to cut it on your Cricut, and even things like the best type of fabric to use when it comes to applying heat transfer vinyl. So make sure you stick around until the end of this video to hear all of my best tips, tricks, and advice when it comes to working with HTV and your Cricut. Let's get into it. Before we jump into how to use heat transfer vinyl, let's first talk about what it is and its intended purpose. Heat transfer vinyl is a type of vinyl that is meant to be applied to fabric surfaces. And it performs the best when applied to those fabric surfaces because that's what it was made to do. When you apply heat transfer vinyl with the correct time, temperature, and pressure, then it holds up fabulously to being washed. Now let's talk a little bit about the terminology around heat transfer vinyl. Because when I was a Cricut beginner, that was by far one of the most confusing things to me. Heat transfer vinyl is usually shortened to the acronym HTV. And that's how you'll hear me refer to it for most of the rest of this video. However, Cricut's house brand of heat transfer vinyl is called iron-on. So you may hear people refer to iron-on or see them write it on social media. And when you hear or see that, they are referring to the same type of vinyl as heat transfer vinyl. One of the really fun parts of working with heat transfer vinyl is just how many different types you have to experiment with. There are everyday types of heat transfer vinyl, such as Cricut Express, glitter HTV that has a glitter texture and a gorgeous shine, pattern HTV like Cricut Fashion Patterns, smooth glitter HTV called Caesar Twinkle, and so many more. Once you get the basics of working with HTV down, then I highly recommend experimenting with different types of HTV so that you can add a different look and more dimension to all of your Cricut projects. Here's what you need to know about working with HTV designs in Cricut Design Space. If you want to cut intricate designs like this mandala, then HTV is going to be a better choice than vinyl. And by vinyl, I mean adhesive vinyl, the kind with the adhesive backing. This is because most types of HTV have a sticky carrier sheet that holds the vinyl in place while it's being cut so it can handle more intricate designs like this. If you're cutting a new HTV for the first time, then I recommend doing a test cut. To make a test cut, add a basic shape to your canvas. So I usually like to add the star shape because of all the points. I feel like it gives me a good idea of whether or not a cut setting is going to go well. So just click it to add it to your canvas and then take that shape and size it to just 1 inch wide. So this is just a super small shape that we're going to cut. Make sure that it's a different color from your final design so you can cut it on its own mat all by itself to test the cut setting. And the purpose for doing this is to test the cut setting on just a little 1 inch wide star to make sure that the cut setting is going to work before you cut a larger design and waste a whole bunch more HTV trying to figure out what cut setting to use. So here's the SVG file that I'm going to be using for today's project. This doesn't have anything to do because this SVG is well made, but make sure that you attach all the light colors and all that kind of good stuff so that everything cuts the way that you want it to. Then once everything is in place and it's going to cut the way that you want it to, click the green Make It button to continue through your project. Here on the prep screen, you want to look for 2 different things. First, double check that your test cut is a different color from your final design so that it cuts on its own mat, and double check that you've toggled on the mirror switch for all of the mats that you're cutting out of HTV. I'll explain why we want to flip our designs 180 degrees when we get to the cut step. Next, we're going to click the green Continue button in the lower right-hand corner, and that will allow our Cricut machine to connect to our device. Next, you want to select your test cut mat with just the test cut on it, and you want to begin by choosing the cut setting that you think is going to work with your heat transfer vinyl. Now, keep in mind that all of the pre-programmed settings in your Cricut machine are intended for Cricut products. So when you're trying to find a cut setting, if you're not using a Cricut product, you just want to get as close as you can so that your Cricut machine will cut it correctly. If you're not sure what cut setting to use, then I recommend checking out the website where you bought your heat transfer vinyl. I purchased my heat transfer vinyl from Heat Transfer Warehouse, and I'm going to be cutting the Cricut Express HTV.
which is one of my absolute favorite everyday HTVs. But they make things like this super easy because if you scroll down on the product page, if you click on application instructions, that will give you all of your press settings. But if you continue scrolling, it will also give you suggested cut settings for different types of cutting machines. So if we scroll down to Cricut, the suggested cut setting is iron on. So that means if you have a Cricut Explore Air 2, you can turn your dial over to the iron on setting. Or if you're like me and you have a different type of Cricut machine, then the next closest cut setting would be the everyday iron on cut setting that's really super close to the regular iron on setting. Then once your cut setting is chosen, let's hop over to my Cricut machine and I'll show you how to do test cuts as well as how to cut your heat transfer vinyl.
HTV usually consists of two different parts. First, you have the HTV on the back side, and then you have something attached to the front of the HTV called the carrier sheet. Now, the carrier sheet is essentially heat-proof transfer tape that keeps everything in place while your HTV is cutting. And sometimes the carrier sheet is more shiny than the backside of the HTV. So when you're cutting HTV, you'll hear the expression shiny side down, which just means to put the carrier sheet face down on the mat with the dull side or the actual HTV facing up at you. But sometimes it can be really challenging to tell which side is more shiny depending on the type of HTV that you're using. So if you're ever unsure, just take your weeding tool and peel up just a really small corner of your HTV and pull some of it back. When you peel the corner away, you can see that this side would be the plasticky carrier sheet and this flexible side would be the actual HTV. So now when we put this down on the mat, we'll know to put this side face down on the mat itself. And this is exactly why we check the mirror button in Design Space so that our Cricut machine can cut our design 180 degrees flipped into the back side of our HTV while the carrier sheet holds it in place on the front side. So when you're ready, grab your cutting mat and secure that shiny side down onto your cutting mat in the sticky area. And then we're gonna begin by cutting that test cut first. So we'll place it in our Cricut machine and allow the Cricut to cut. Then when your Cricut is finished, you can unload it. And we're gonna double check how that test cut to determine whether this is the best cut setting for our HTV or not. So I'm simply gonna take my weeding tool and I'm gonna pull that star out from where my Cricut just cut it. And we can see that it weeded super easily. When we look at the background, we don't see any snagged edges and it didn't cut super deep into the carrier sheet. So that means that it is the best cut setting for us. So then you can proceed cutting the rest of your design. I cut enough HTV so that I can actually just flip my sheet around and cut my design on the same sheet that I cut my test cut. However, if your test cut did not go well, if any of the edges of the HTV are snagged or if it was super difficult to weed, then go back into Cricut Design Space and scoot your star over a little bit further. Try another cut setting that you think will work for this HTV prior to cutting your entire design so that you're only wasting 1 inch of HTV at a time instead of an entire sheet. So then when you're ready to cut your full design, you can just place it back in your Cricut machine and allow your Cricut to work its magic. Once your machine is finished cutting your design, next you're going to remove the excess from around the design in a process called weeding. Now, because we have the carrier sheet on the front side of the HTV holding everything in place, you want to weed your design from the back side with the sticky side of the carrier sheet facing up at you. Then once you've weeded everything that you think is not a part of your design, I recommend flipping it over and looking at it from the front side to double check that you didn't miss any pieces before you press it on your blank. In order to press your HTV correctly, you need to know 3 pieces of information, and that is the time, temperature, and pressure recommended for your HTV by the manufacturer. But it can be super tricky to know what application settings to use for each type of HTV. So the first place I recommend that you check is the website where you purchase the HTV from. For this project, I'll be using Cricut Express HTV from Heat Transfer Warehouse. And as you guys saw earlier, Heat Transfer Warehouse has the application instructions for every single type of HTV that they carry right on the product page of their website. I absolutely love when companies make it so easy to know the suggested application settings. And speaking of Heat Transfer Warehouse, I want to thank them for sponsoring today's video. But don't worry, even though there's a sponsor for today's video, all of the opinions and information that I'm sharing with you today are my own. If the company where you purchase the HTV does not have the suggested application settings, then I suggest just simply Googling it. Search something like how to press X HTV and see if any of the manufacturer's websites come up with suggested application instructions. So to begin pressing your shirt, the first thing you need to do is set the correct settings onto your heat source. So I already have 250 degrees preheated on my heat press. And if I click through the settings, I have 5 seconds of time. And then lastly, before I actually place my shirt onto my press, I need to double check that my pressure is correct. So I'll do a sample press and double check that I can feel that the pressure is firm, and it is. So now we're good to go, and I can begin lining up my design on my blank. So the next step to pressing your HTV is laying out whatever you're gonna be pressing it on, whether that's a blank or a shirt. Then the next tool that I recommend you keep in your craft space is one of these t-shirt guides. You can use these underneath the collar of your shirt to ensure that you have the center line correct, because you can't always rely on the placement of the tag. And the t-shirt guide ensures that you have at least 3 inches between the collar and your design. That's what I would recommend using for an adult sized shirt. Then grab your HTV design, and I like to take the non-sticky sides and place them together and line up the edges. And that way I can press a seam into the middle of my design so I know exactly where the center line is. Don't worry, pressing into your HTV carrier sheet is not going to affect the actual design at all. Then once you have a line pressed in it, you can pull it back, and now we can see a clear center line down our carrier sheet. And now we can line it up using the center of our t-shirt guide. So that's a little trick for making things way, way easier. Then once you have your design where you like it, you can push down the sticky carrier sheet and remove that t-shirt guide, and I'll finish smoothing it down to make sure that it's nice and secure. Now my heat press actually has like a little portable piece of foam that I like to place my shirt on before I put it inside the heat press. So I'm gonna place this underneath the shirt, and when I line the shirt up on my foam, I'm gonna ensure that there are no other seams on this piece of foam. So that means the collar is going to be pushed off of the edges of the foam, and so are the sleeves. That way I can double check that all of the pressure from the heat press is getting onto my design and it's not being taken away from by another seam. Then when I'm ready to place my shirt in my heat press, I'll open up my heat press and place the shirt and the foam piece on the bottom, which the bottom of the heat press is called a platen, and it's the non-hot part of the heat press. Then I'm gonna cover my HTV with a cover sheet. I like to use Teflon because it's reusable, but you can also use a piece of parchment paper to protect the heat source from getting any kind of HTV on it. Then I'll close the heat press and press for the correct time and temperature. Once the timer goes off, I'll open up the heat press and remove the Teflon sheet. Once your press is finished, the last step is to remove the carrier sheet. Now you want to pay attention in the application instructions to what temperature you should peel the carrier sheet. Cricut Express is listed as a warm or a cold peel. And what that means is that if you want to peel it warm, it's just warm enough so that you can touch the carrier sheet without burning your fingers. Or cold peel means actually letting the HTV cool on the shirt before you peel that carrier sheet. The peeling instructions are important too, so make sure you pay attention depending on the type of HTV that you're using. But when you're ready, you're just gonna remove the carrier sheet. And once the carrier sheet is removed, your press is finished. Now that you know how to press HTV, let's talk about another really confusing topic for beginners, and that's the material that you can press HTV on. Pretty much all HTV is gonna do great when being pressed on cotton, polyester, or cotton polyester blends. So when shopping for blanks or shirts, look out for those materials so that you know for sure you can press HTV on them. If you are working with shirts that are mostly polyester, then they are probably going to be really stretchy. So you may want to consider using a product like Cut Soft or Caesar Stretch, especially if those shirts are really tightly fitted. If you come across shirts or blanks that are marked for sublimation, then you can use any type of HTV on them that you want. Materials that do not press well with HTV are synthetic materials. A couple of examples of synthetic materials are acrylic, modal, and rayon, and any others like it. The reason that these do not press well with HTV is because they are very, very likely to scorch. Scorching shows up as a big shiny area on your garment where your heat press has just pressed. This does not go away after the garment has cooled down. So that's why it's best to avoid synthetic materials when pressing HTV if possible. However, sometimes you do end up having to press materials like this, and there's a couple of ways that you can reduce the risk of scorching with your HTV. The first is to find a type of HTV that applies at a lower temperature. Say for example, Cricut Express only needs to apply at 250 degrees Fahrenheit, which is definitely on the low end of HTV application temperatures. Another thing you can do to reduce the risk of scorching is to take your application time and break it into small sections of your press. So say for example, your HTV needs to press for 15 seconds. You could do 3 5-second presses and let your garment cool in between those presses, and that is very likely to help you reduce the risk of scorching. What was the most helpful tip that you learned about HTV in this video? Let me know down in the comments below. If you learned something new in this tutorial, then be sure to give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the DIY Alex YouTube channel for more videos a lot like this one every single Tuesday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. I love getting to know you guys, so if we're not already connected on social media, then please be sure to search for me at DIY Alex Vanover on all your favorite social media platforms. All the hearts.